Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse, originally released for Famicom and Nintendo Entertainment System, but it was later ported to other systems. The footage you'll be seeing throughout this video was recorded from the Castlevania Anniversary Collection version of the game, which is available on Steam, and more specifically you're going to be seeing a combination of the Japanese version of the game and the US version of the game. It's primarily going to be the Japanese version, however, because of something that I will talk about when I get to the presentation. This is an action platformer by Konami that serves as both a follow-up to Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest and a prequel to the storyline of the original Castlevania. It was originally released for the Famicom in 1989 and ported over to the Nintendo Entertainment System the following year, and it didn't get a European release until 2 years later in 1992. And it's gone on to become considered an absolute classic, arguably the best game among the 3 NES titles in the series, and not only one of the kind of definitive titles for the NES platform in general, but also one of the more difficult games on said platform, which of course also makes it considered one of the most difficult games in the Castlevania series, if not the most difficult game in the series, which I'm sure you can imagine went over rather well with someone like me who is absolutely terrible at platformers, which, once again, disclaimer, I am terrible at platformers, don't expect masterful gameplay footage here. On a similar note, I never played this back in the day. Once again, I went straight from Atari 2600 to the Sega Genesis, so I skipped over the NES entirely and never got a chance to play Castlevania 3 back in the day. Therefore, I have absolutely no nostalgia for this thing whatsoever. So what exactly do you get when you boot up Castlevania 3 and start to mess around with it? Well, let's go ahead and start delving right into this and find out, starting like we usually do with the presentation. Now, in terms of visuals, I would term this as something of a hybrid between the more detailed sprite work of Castlevania 2 and the color palettes of the original Castlevania, in the sense that the sprite work itself is certainly fairly detailed for its time and given the platform it's on, but what they've decided to do with the color schemes can be rather grating on the eyes. A lot of the stages just have really garish color schemes that really make it hard to see what you're doing a lot of the time, and more importantly, it can actually get in your way fairly often when you're jumping around on various platforms and you see something that looks like a platform, but if you jump on it, you just pass straight through because it's actually part of the background instead. So if anything, instead of an outright improvement compared to Castlevania 2, it's really more of a side grade than anything else. Some things certainly look better, other things look worse, it just depends on what you're looking at, and a lot of it comes down to the actual color schemes themselves. And to make matters worse, Nintendo had a policy of censoring the living crap out of anything that was released on their platforms up until about the mid-90s or so, which results in Castlevania 3 having a lot of its religious iconography removed entirely or toned down to the point where it's practically non-existent. And things like the statues and the Medusa were all covered up a bit more to make them not quite as risque, even though there's nothing at all risque about them. Of course, the Japanese version of the game doesn't have any such problems, and thus it ends up actually being the superior version based on that alone, but on top of that, the Japanese version of the game actually has superior sound design to that of the Western release, and that's simply due to the hardware limitations. You see, the Famicom actually did support external audio chips that were basically built into the cartridges themselves, whereas the NES did not. So, the Western release didn't have the additional VRC6 sound chip that was included in the cartridges for the Japanese version, and thus the Western release of the game has far weaker sound design than that of the Japanese version. And if you don't believe me, well, here's a couple of examples just so you can have an idea of what I'm talking about. As I'm sure you can tell even from such short clips, the Japanese version has several additional audio channels that give the music quite a bit more depth, and even though the sound effects themselves are generally pretty much the same between the two versions, but maybe with a bit more depth in the channels, it still ends up being an overall far better experience listening to what you have on the Japanese version of the game, rather than the very basic 8-bit sound that you get on the Western release. But despite not being able to realize the soundtrack to its full potential, the Western version of the game still has the Castlevania 3 soundtrack, and that remains one of the better soundtracks available in the NES library. And considering all the great soundtracks that are available in the NES library, that's pretty impressive. It's got really nice and catchy 8-bit tunes that really do get you into the action, and some of which actually do a pretty good job of providing some additional atmosphere to the levels that they're in. Although what little atmosphere the game does have is ultimately going to be shattered once you actually get into the gameplay mechanics, but I'll get to that more in a moment. Suffice to say though, the sound design overall, despite the Western version being clearly inferior to the Japanese version in terms of the technical aspects, still ends up being absolutely fantastic for its era, and it still holds up rather well to this day, which is much more than you can say for the visuals, let's put it that way. But here's the thing, regardless of how well the visuals and sounds still hold up, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and while there isn't much of a story in this, of course it being an NES game, there is still something to be had here in terms of the setup, and you actually do get bits of story as you continue through the game. This is mostly due to the inclusion of some extra dialogue with certain characters that you'll encounter throughout the game, and even though there's not much in the way of the dialogue and it never really goes very far, ultimately, this does still have more story than was present in both Castlevania 1 and Castlevania 2, and in fact you could say both of them combined. So what exactly is the storyline of Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse? Well, in this one you actually play an ancestor of Simon Belmont, named Trevor Belmont, on his quest to defeat the evil Lord Dracula and restore peace to the land. Along the way you will encounter 3 additional characters, each of whom can be recruited to fight alongside you, although you can only have one of them at any given time. These additional characters are Grant, who throws daggers as his main weapon and also can climb on walls and ceilings, Sypha, who has a very short range, very weak melee attack consisting of basically swinging a stick at the enemies. I assume it's supposed to be a wand, because she is actually a mage. All of her special attacks are actually spells that are very powerful. And then of course there is the third character, which is the son of Dracula himself, Alucard, who can turn into a bat and casts fireballs. When you encounter these characters, they offer to help you defeat Dracula, and if you accept their help, then you can switch between them whenever you want at the press of the select button, and you gain access to all of their abilities and whatever sub-weapon they have equipped at that time. Unlike sub-weapons, however, the characters don't have their own individual life bars. They both share the same life bar, so if you keep getting clobbered, then you're going to have low health no matter what. Now, of course, the unique movement abilities of both Grant and Alucard also mean that you can tackle the stages in slightly different ways than you ordinarily would with just playing as, say, Trevor Belmont, in which case you can actually navigate through a level and avoid a lot of enemies if you're playing as Alucard, although you do need quite a few hearts to be able to turn into a bat in the first place. Grant, on the other hand, allows you to move along walls and ceilings by basically staying hooked to them with the D-pad, but if you mess up that even slightly, then he'll just go falling off the wall or the ceiling or whatever the case may be, and more often than not, that'll be directly into an instant death pit, which means that you're going to be restarting a section, or if you've run out of continues, then your game is entirely over. So you do have to weigh the pros and cons of picking up each individual character, because again, you can only have one of them at any given time, and you can only pick up them at certain points in the game, so if you don't pick up Grant at the point where he is available at the beginning, then you're not going to be able to use him for the rest of the game. Likewise, if you do the same with Sypha, or you do the same with Alucard, then you're not going to be able to use them throughout the rest of the game. The ending of the game does change depending on who you actually have with you at the time you finish, but it doesn't really change that much. It basically adds a bit about that particular character and what they do after defeating Dracula, and the rest of the outro crawl pretty much remains exactly the same. The sum total of the storyline ends up being the intro crawl, which sets up what's actually going on, as well as the dialogue you have with the 3 characters when you encounter them, and then of course the outro crawl, and there's really nothing in between those moments, so there's really not a whole lot going on in terms of story, but it's still more than what we got in Castlevania 1 and 2, and it does serve as the basis for the eternally cursed Belmont bloodline story that would continue throughout the rest of the Castlevania series, and it even serves serves as the basis for the plot of the Castlevania series on Netflix, which, if you haven't seen yet, is actually rather good if you like anime and you like Castlevania. So while it certainly may not be all that impressive by modern standards, and even by the standards of the day, it wasn't particularly impressive, it still ended up having a pretty lasting effect on the Castlevania series as a whole. But what about the gameplay itself? Well, that's where things mostly ended up staying the same compared to the original Castlevania. You see, after Castlevania 1, they decided to take a pretty wildly different route with Castlevania 2, and then they decided to go back to the series' roots with Castlevania 3. So this plays almost identically in a lot of ways to the original Castlevania. You still have a jump button, you still have your basic attack button, up, and then the attack button is whatever sub-weapon you have equipped, or if you're playing as Sypha, whatever spell she has. And the moment-to-moment gameplay is simply moving to the right and defeating any enemy in your path as you navigate through the increasingly treacherous areas with a lot of instant death pits to fall into. There are only two major differences compared to how the original Castlevania plays. Those are the addition of the 3 extra characters that you can have along the way, which I've already gone over, as well as the addition of a series of branching paths that you will encounter at the end of certain stages, where you have the opportunity to choose between one of 2 different stages. This is how you'll encounter the additional characters that you can select, and you can actually go down certain paths that will prevent you from accessing other characters. So for example, if you don't want to play as Grant at all, then you can actually skip his stage entirely and just keep going through the rest of the game. And while that does add a bit of variety and a slight bit of replay value, you have to keep in mind this is still an action platformer circa 1989. It's still very simplistic and it's still very short. If you go through the entire game and don't lose a single life, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of about an hour to an hour and a half long. And unlike in Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest, where the main challenge was simply knowing where to go and what to do, the challenge in this is back to Castlevania 1, which means the game is founded on arcade game principles of being as completely BS difficult as it possibly can in order to get as much playtime as possible out of the player. And when I say BS difficulty, I mean a lot of the time taking damage is completely unavoidable, and more importantly, if you take damage, then you get knocked back. Well, if you get knocked back into an instant death pit, congratulations, you're restarting a section. And to make matters worse, the game has a lot of areas where the stairs are the only way you can progress from one area to another, and they just tend to throw a lot of enemies at you that you really can't avoid being on the stairs. Whether it be projectiles that hit you from the enemies that you can't actually reach, or it be things like Medusa heads that will fly by. And while thankfully when you're on the stairs you don't get knocked back, but you're still going to be taking that damage, and the further you get into the game, the more difficult it gets, the more enemies it throws at you, and the more environmental hazards it throws at you. Because unlike in the original Castlevania, there's a lot more environmental hazards, whether it be spikes, or things like collapsing platforms that you need to watch out for, or even platforms that will just fall out from under you almost instantly, and you need to avoid them whenever you can. The difficulty is ultimately rather relentless, and to make matters worse, the Japanese version is actually still easier than the American version, and that's not necessarily because it's a noticeably easier game, it's because they implemented a couple of slight changes in the American version that make it even more difficult. Namely, enemies do damage based on stages in the American version instead of based on what enemy type it is like in the Japanese version. Dracula himself actually attacks more often and actually has longer reach attacks in the American version, and the American version starts you back at the beginning of the second part of Dracula's stage, as opposed to right at the steps of the castle like in the Japanese version. This amplifies the already high difficulty of this simply by nature of being an 80s action platformer developed on arcade game principles and thus being as BS difficult as possible to keep you playing it, and ends up making this really more of an endurance run than anything else. Now the Japanese version's a bit less of an endurance run, but it is still pretty brutal, and that does ultimately end up making the game incredibly frustrating to play through. In fact, it can become downright infuriating to play, even more so than the original Castlevania, precisely because so much of that difficulty is BS that you really don't have a way of avoiding. There's really not a whole lot you can do about hitbox issues on certain traps where it doesn't necessarily look like you should be hit by damage, but you still get hit and instantly die from something. Or if you're stuck in a position where you can't get around an enemy and the floor is falling out from under you, then well, you're just kind of screwed. Or if you're stuck on the stairs and just getting constantly whittled down, there's really not a whole lot you can do about that. Some of the jumps you have to make are surprisingly precise for an 80s platformer, and with the way the controls are and the way that the hitboxes work, a lot of times you'll actually end up hitting something in the scenery and just instantly falling to your doom without anything you can do to stop it. And there's even a stage where the screen constantly keeps moving up, and if you get caught at the bottom, then you just instantly die and have to start the entire section over. Not to mention the numerous flying enemies you'll encounter, which are rather difficult to hit, and more often than not the game doesn't really give you the proper sub-weapons to deal with something like that, so you just kind of have to wait and maybe let yourself get hit a couple of times before they get into a position where you can actually do something about it. So it really ends up being a matter of not necessarily that the game is difficult, it's why it's difficult, and the difficulty comes almost entirely from BS and not actual challenge. Of course, that was the norm back in the 80s. People expected games to be that kind of difficult because they were used to arcade titles that were trying to gobble up as many quarters as possible. Obviously you don't have that on a home console, but they still wanted to keep people playing them as long as possible to try to discourage rentals and such, so arcade game principles still applied, and while that's certainly fine for 1989 standards, although they were starting to get away from that in the late 80s and on into the early 90s, unfortunately those really don't hold up very well in 2019. You go into something like this, and it will immediately put you in a bad mood, because you're sitting there expecting to have some fun with a video game, and it's just clobbering you the entire time. And thus, even though the soundtrack is fantastic, and this is the most technologically advanced Castlevania game on the NES, and of course it has some interesting gameplay principles, what with the multiple characters and the branching pathways, unfortunately, this actually somehow ends up being even more infuriating to play than the original Castlevania, and even to a lesser degree, Castlevania 2. And as a result, I really can't recommend this to really anyone except people who were playing it back in the day and just want to go back for a bit of nostalgia. In fact, and I'm sure that some of you out there will think I'm biased for this or whatever the case may be, but I really can't start recommending any Castlevania games at all until they hit the 16-bit era. But I'll take a look at those at a different time. For now, I will have a link in the video description box to where you can pick this up in the Castlevania Anniversary Collection if you're interested in being a complete masochist about it, but regardless of what you decide on that front, thanks for watching.